The following program is a special presentation of the Big Ten Network, produced in association with the University of Wisconsin.
Most scientists agree that climate change is a tangible threat to our planet, and now many people, businesses, and countries are attempting to go green. But what steps has the U.S. taken to fight climate change? Scientists are urging drastic action be taken immediately. We'll look at climate change and the implications national legislation could have on your everyday life and our economy. Next, during office hours. Hi, I'm Ken Goldstein, Professor of Political Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. How we affect our environment has long been a concern for many Americans and people across the globe. Early in December of 2009, the United Nations will convene a climate change conference in Copenhagen, Denmark, to discuss the issues and impact of climate change on the planet. Joining me today to discuss climate change and its effects are Professor Tom Eggert from the Wisconsin School of Business and Professor Dan Vimont in the Department of Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences. Tom is the co-director of the Business Environment and Social Responsibility Program and director of the Wisconsin Sustainable Business Council. Dan is involved in the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts and recently released a report with estimates of what Wisconsin's future climate will look like. Gentlemen, welcome to Office Hours. Let me start with a question on exactly where we are and what we know in terms of climate change. What's a reasonable range of opinion, a reasonable consensus on where we stand now?
The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change would be a good place to find that consensus. And their statement is that warming of the planet is unequivocal. And they represent the consensus, the broad consensus across the scientific community. So there's really no doubt that our planet has been warming. There's also no doubt that carbon dioxide is increasing in our atmosphere, and there's no doubt that that increase in carbon dioxide is due to human emissions. So the statement from the IPCC is that the warming that we've observed over the last 50 years especially is very likely due to human causes, and that represents the broad consensus across the scientific community. So
obviously these are complicated estimates and complicated methods to figure this out, but how do we know? There's an ebb and flow in climate change. Yeah. How do we know exactly what the change is? How do we know that it's human activity that's the big coefficient, largely responsible for this?
There's several pieces of evidence, and I think the one that's probably the easiest to grasp is also how we project climate change into the future, and that's by using global climate models. And what we can do is we can run a global climate model using observed variations in solar output and variations of volcanic output. And we can try and reproduce the warming that we've observed, especially over the last 50 years. And if we don't include anthropogenic emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, we can't reproduce the warming. But if we do include those anthropogenic greenhouse gases...
Anthropogenic means?
Due to humans.
Okay.
Yes, human emissions, fossil fuels primarily, but also due to changes in land use. If we don't include those anthropogenic greenhouse gases, then we can't reproduce the warming. If we do, then we do reproduce the warming.
There's obviously going to be a political fight. There already is a political fight about cap and trade and some other regulations or possible regulations, and we're going to talk about this in our time here. But in some sense, business has accepted that there is climate change, and in some ways, the debate and the drama that's going on around is not relevant to many businesses at this point. Is that a correct statement?
I completely agree that business has gotten to the point that the arguments about the science are irrelevant. Customers are expecting businesses to go green. Investors are expecting businesses to go green. Businesses are getting pressure from their supply chains to go green. So all of these drivers and a number of others, business needs to respond to, and the businesses that are choosing not to respond are putting themselves at a competitive disadvantage at this point.
Now, is that the case for all businesses? Because there's also major business groups that are lobbying very actively against cap and trade.
Right.
So The coal industry, have they accepted this as accepted fact and they're not?
Well, I mean, with any change, there will be winners and losers, and I think we acknowledge that. The most recent studies suggest that the winners are going to far outpace the losers. It still doesn't change the fact that they're going to be losers, and that companies that are on the side that will be disproportionately impacted economically are fighting like crazy against regulation, changes in the laws, just progress on the climate change issue. But I'd point out there are also a significant number of companies that have joined groups like the U.S. Climate Action Plan, U.S. CAP, and are actually lobbying the government to put climate change laws in place. Because what is most difficult for business is the uncertainty. Once we have a law in place, and I think all businesses realize we will have a law at some point. They don't know for sure what it's going to look like or what it's going to require of them, thus all the uncertainty at this point. The sooner we get to the point that we've reached some certainty, the sooner business can get into the business of doing what they do best, and that is responding to the sort of the new arrangements or the new requirements on them.
We're going to break to commercial here in a couple seconds, but business can deal with change. Business doesn't like to deal with uncertainty.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Please stay with us. We will continue our discussion of climate change and how business is evolving in reaction to climate change. Please stay with us on Office Hours.
This program is a production of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. If you have comments about this broadcast, please email them to programming@uc.wisc.edu.
For more than 100 years, the University of Wisconsin has been inspired by the Wisconsin idea,
which says the good work of the university extends to the boundaries of the state and beyond.
So the UW works hard to help build Wisconsin's economy.
Educate people of all ages.
Advance health and medicine.
And enhance the quality of life for all of us.
Hey!
The University of Wisconsin-Madison. Forward thinking.
Welcome back to Office Hours, where we're discussing climate change with Tom Eggert from the Wisconsin School of Business and Dan Vimont. Dan, let me talk to you a little bit about some Wisconsin-specific findings. You and some collaborators, some colleagues here at UW-Madison recently did a study focusing on the effects of climate change in Wisconsin. And I think as you talk, we have some graphics which we'll show as well. But tell me about what you found specifically, what we're likely to see here in the Badger State.
Yeah, well, we did two things. We first of all did a reconstruction of historical trends in our state, and that was done by Chris Kucharik at the Nelson Institute Center for Sustainability and the Global Environment. And the other thing that we did is we developed a set of projections for future climate change. And one of the things that we've seen is that we've already seen large changes in our state. We've seen increases in precipitation. We've seen warming, especially across the central part of the state, of 1 to 2 degrees Fahrenheit already, and that's since, say, 1950 or thereabouts. And we've seen changes in, for example, a reduction in the number of very cold days. One of the things that we found is that the cold seasons tend to warm more than the warm season does. And nighttime minimum temperatures tend to warm more than the daytime maximum temperatures. And we've seen that in the historical record. What's interesting is we've also seen those same things occurring for the future projections, that the models project that the winter will warm more than the summer, and that nighttime minimum temperatures will warm more than daytime maximum.
So what you found in Wisconsin, could I just take that to any other state and make those same conclusions, or is any of that specific to Wisconsin? Some
of it is specific to Wisconsin. There will be a lot of other states will have observed a similar amount of warming. Warming has been pretty large scale, but it won't be universal. And certainly the impacts of that warming will be very different here than, say, Arizona. And then, as we're looking into the future, the impacts will, the future changes will be very different as well between, say, here and the southern U.S. One of the things we're seeing here is a drastic increase, especially in the southern part of the state, the number of very warm days, so days that exceed, say, 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Currently, that happens a few times a year, and we're expecting up to 3 or 4 weeks of days with maximum temperatures above 90. And then certainly a decrease in the number of very cold days, especially in the northern part of the state as well.
Tom, in terms of the business distribution in Wisconsin, we're not a coal-producing state,
right,
but my understanding is we have a disproportionate reliance on coal-powered plants for electricity.
Correct.
So if some sort of international or national restrictions are passed, that's going to have a disproportionate impact on the state of Wisconsin, correct?
Right. That's the argument that both Senator Cole and Senator Feingold made in a letter that they sent off to the leadership in the Senate. The fear is that as we price carbon with whatever mechanism we use, cap and trade, carbon tax, however it gets priced, because we think it will get priced at some point, because we are so heavily coal dependent, we will be disproportionately impacted by the increase in price, however that gets attached to carbon, putting our industries, and we still are a manufacturing state, at a competitive disadvantage to other states that are not as dependent on coal.
In terms of, and is it possible to make these distinctions, there's carbon getting created across the country, across the world. It's having an effect in Wisconsin, having a particular effect in Wisconsin. What function of how we're doing here in terms of our climate has to do with what we're actually producing, if we were to talk parochially, or is it just a general?
That's an interesting question. Actually, very little of the impacts, what we feel in Wisconsin has very little to do with what we emit in Wisconsin. Now, that being said, there are a lot of very good reasons for doing something and being proactive about mitigating, so reducing the amount of carbon emissions, mitigating on a local scale in Wisconsin, and that's the governor's task force and the Climate Change Action Initiative. But in reality, the impacts of climate change, and that would be addressed by the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts, those impacts are going to depend on what happens globally.
And when we come back, I want to talk more about the Wisconsin Initiative, and I want to talk more about some incentives or disincentives that business has to go along with that. So please stay with us as we continue our discussion of climate change here on Office Hours. Welcome back to Office Hours. I'm here with Dan Vimont and Tom Eggert. Tom, I'm not quite sure how to ask this. Maybe the sitting on the bar stool question. If I'm in Wisconsin, Dan's telling me it's warmer. You're telling me that any sort of reform is going to disproportionately have an effect on the state of Wisconsin. Warmer's better in Wisconsin, and I don't want to pay more.
Right.
Give me an argument that you would tell someone sitting next to you at a bar.
Well, I mean, so I'll make the economic argument, and that is our manufacturing industries here are very dependent on the energy supplies that we have. As we seek to maintain our competitiveness, to attract new industries in the state, to become the state that people want to come to, we need the, sort of returning to the certainty argument, we need the certainty that's associated with predicting the future. The other side of that argument is if we become too parochial and we say, well, we don't really care what happens to the rest of the country. I mean, there are some pretty profound economic consequences to the rest of the country that we will be impacted by. There was a report released in England, in the UK, a couple of years ago called the Stern Report, and it was by a series of economists, and all they looked at was the economic implications of climate change. Responding to climate change now is estimated to take between 0.5% and 1% of global domestic production. So not an insignificant number. It's a large number. If we wait a couple of years, it goes up to 1.5% to 2%. And these are real costs that we'll have to pay if we decide we're just going to do nothing, responding on the backside, being reactive to what to what's happened as the carbon concentrations in the atmosphere have gone up, becomes much more expensive, 5 to 10% of gross domestic product on a global scale. So I think we can't just be parochial in thinking about what are the implications here, because we are one state of 50 states.
Dan, talk to me a little bit about that from your perspective.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out that there are going to be winners and losers in this. One of the winners might be the growing season. A warmer climate in Wisconsin means that spring comes a little earlier, fall comes a little later. More of a growing season might be good. On the other side, warmer temperatures in, say, northern Wisconsin means that the ground isn't frozen as long. And if the ground isn't frozen, then you can't log in marshy areas. And so a decrease in, say, logging. Warmer temperatures also mean drastic reduction in habitat for cold water fish, for different species in northern Wisconsin, changes in forestry, invasive species, lack of winter tourism, and so forth. So we need to understand both sides of that, and that's one of the things that we're trying to do as part of this Wisconsin initiative on climate change impacts.
But it's also the case that if the effect is because of global happenings, and we do legislation in Wisconsin, we do legislation in the United States, and in India and China they don't do anything, you can understand the concerns of a business in Wisconsin that's going to be disproportionately affected by this.
Sure, but I think it's also important to remember that on a local scale, we need to take advantage of potentially emerging markets. And here's something where I think a point that you made earlier, that being able to anticipate potential social changes and how we adapt to those social changes, as well as adapting to the physical changes of climate change, which I think was a really interesting comment.
Right. Would you make a similar argument?
Yeah,
I'm sort of giving you a cartoonish, angry guy argument, but I think it's something that people are thinking.
And so I guess the argument is how parochial can we be without really endangering ourselves in the future? And I'd argue, it's our history up to this point. The United States was the only nation that didn't sign the Kyoto Protocol. We sort of said, we get to do what we want to do. And there are some pretty significant consequences from sort of that isolationist perspective.
Okay, we'll pick up on that. Dan Vimont, Tom Eggert, please stay with us on Office Hours as we finish up our discussion of climate change.
This program is a production of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. If you have comments about this broadcast, please email them to programming@uc.wisc.edu.
Welcome back to Office Hours, where we're discussing climate change and how business may be adapting to it or forced to adapt to it with Dan Vimont and Tom Eggert. Tom, so the Environmental Protection Agency, major regulatory body in this country of a variety of things, has just signaled that they plan to make a pretty major decision, doing something called endangerment when it comes to carbon emissions. That's not gotten a lot of coverage. That has huge, phenomenally huge implications. Tell us about that.
Yes. So a couple of years ago, the EPA and the Bush administration were taken to court. The Supreme Court ultimately found that carbon dioxide was an air pollutant and ordered the EPA to regulate carbon dioxide. The trigger for that regulation is an endangerment finding. And as you said, EPA has their draft endangerment finding out at this point. I think the consensus is that EPA will satisfy the criteria for an endangerment finding and is prepared to start down the road to regulating carbon dioxide. Obviously, if we regulate carbon dioxide, it's a true regulatory program. We will set emission levels as we do with other air pollutants. We'll put permit programs in place. It'll be a very traditional approach. Business doesn't want regulation of carbon dioxide. They would much rather have a cap and trade program. They might even rather have a carbon tax than a true regulatory program. So they're arguing hard.
Because the regulatory program is not predictable.
It's not predictable. It's not very efficient from an economic perspective. It's very expensive. It's going to be very difficult to implement. It'll be very complicated. It's much more desirable to go down a cap and trade route or a carbon tax route, I think. I mean, I know the cap and trade route would satisfy that requirement. But business isn't crazy about going down the cap and trade or the carbon tax route either. And so at some point, business is going to get to the point where they're going to have to choose the lesser of two evils, because EPA will move. In fact, they have no choice but to move. They've been ordered by the Supreme Court to move forward on regulating carbon dioxide. That's the gorilla in the closet. That's why, I know we had talked before, I think there actually will be legislation that will come out, not because business wants legislation, but because it's the lesser of two evils.
Okay. Dan, we got about a minute left. Tell me some of the things you're involved. We talked about your research here in the state of Wisconsin, but how you've been involved in these policy proposals here in the state of Wisconsin and the initiative.
Yeah, so we've put together this Wisconsin initiative on climate change impacts, and the goal of that group is to assess how climate may affect our state and then to develop adaptation strategies. That's really just getting going, but it's just taken off in the last 2 years. There's something like 220 people around the state who are now involved with it. So I'm really optimistic about what we're doing in the state to adapt to climate change, the inevitable climate change we'll experience.
And you have a conference going on here soon.
We do, December 3rd,
okay.
At Discovery World in Milwaukee, Wisconsin Sustainable Business Council Conference. It'll bring businesses from around the state together that are interested in sustainability, making progress towards sustainability, and have business talk to business about what's working, how they're doing it, how do you put a sustainability report together, how do you implement an environmental management system, how do you brand yourself green, how do you avoid charges of greenwashing, really, and all business speakers talking to businesses about what they're doing. The interesting thing about this, and for your audience, students are free. So website is bus.wisc.edu/sustainability/council.
Excellent. Dan, Tom, thank you for joining us here today on Office Hours. That's all our time today. If you want to see some of our other topics we've covered in previous Office Hours shows, please look us up on the web at officehours.poli-sci.wisc.edu. From the University of Wisconsin-Madison, this has been Office Hours. Thanks for stopping by.
The preceding program was produced by the University of Wisconsin in association with the Big Ten Network.